Welcome to the Think Factory podcast. We got one question for you. What keeps you up at night?
Welcome to the Think Factory's Workplace podcast, powered by OGC Solutions, the podcast where we explore the ever-evolving landscape of workplace dynamics. My name is Alka Bahal. I'm a partner with Outside General Counsel Solutions and the chair of our Corporate Immigration Services Group, and I'll be your host today. I'm very excited to have with me here Taryn Abrams, founder and CEO of Empower Behavioral Services. Welcome to the podcast, Taryn. Did I say your name correctly? Abrams?
It's actually pronounced Abrahams, but you did,
Abraham.
You did great.
I did terrible.
It's like Abraham Lincoln with an S.
I love it. I did terrible.
All good. I appreciate you asking.
Can you start by telling our listeners a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Of course, but I want to first start off by thanking you, Alka, for inviting me onto your podcast. I always welcome the opportunity to talk about leadership and workplace culture. And so I'm really delighted to be here. So thank you. So a little bit about myself. So I call myself a workplace behavioral specialist, and I'm sure the audience is probably thinking, what is that? It really is about me leveraging my experience as a psychotherapist. My career started off in the clinical space. And I basically offer training and coaching and consulting services to help workplaces modernize their environment to create engaged, inclusive, respectful workplaces. And my focus is really about helping individuals as well as leaders, employees and leaders, improve their emotional intelligence, which I feel is an extremely important part of effective leadership and cultivating positive workplace cultures. So that is what I do.
That is wonderful. And I know the really unique thing about you is that you're bringing this clinical background into the workplace, which I think is just incredible. The way you probably have this ability to deal with EQ, emotional intelligence, and soft skills on a level others just don't.
Yeah. And I would say you just kind of hit the nail on the head in terms of what the differentiating factor is between me and an HR specialist. Even though I play in the HR space, my focus is very specific. It's very much on interpersonal skills, like you mentioned, emotional intelligence skills, which I feel is extremely important because we do bring our entire self to work. And as much as we'd like to say that we check our stuff at the door, right, our baggage, our triggers, we spend a lot of time at work. And so very oftentimes that stuff really contributes in terms of how we show up at work, whether we're an individual employee or a leader. But I do want to preface, and it's funny, this comes up often. I no longer am practicing. However, people call me the business therapist, which I find is a really sort of interesting, label to create, because, I don't psychoanalyze anymore, although I do have that intellectual property on the back end. So when I'm talking with someone or when I'm working or coaching with someone, I'm always thinking systemic. I'm always thinking about, what could be driving their behavior? What are some of the underlying issues that might be impacting how they're showing up at work? Sometimes I delve a little bit into that with them, but I do keep it high level, right? So if anyone is thinking, oh God, that sounds scary, it's really not. It's really more about just sort of gaining a deeper perspective in terms of, what drives our personality, what drives our behaviors, and helping people to create light bulb moments. I would say that is probably the biggest skill set that I have. Is really getting people to think deeper about themselves. And when you understand yourself better, you can navigate the world better.
That is so insightful. So true. I love that. And that must be so satisfying, creating that light bulb moment to help someone
really
understand about themselves. Because you really do bring your whole self to your work.
Yeah.
What are you checking? Really, what are you checking at the door? You are who you are. And if you're not yourself at work and you're not entirely yourself at home, that's probably what's helping feed these sort of fractured, hard to, make our own decisions sort of issues.
It's true. It's true. And it's amazing how many people lack the, and lack the ability to connect the dots.
Mm-hmm.
You could be going through a divorce. Your child could be struggling, maybe going into rehab. You may have had a recent loss. And we don't necessarily stop and think and reflect of how that impacts what we do at work.
Mm-hmm.
And so often I will be working with an individual, like in a coaching space, and they get referred to me because they're flying off the handle at work, or they just have poor impulse control, or they're not making good sound decisions. And 9 times out of 10, there's some fire burning in their personal
Mm-hmm.
life. And
Right.
sometimes just connecting the dots is a light bulb moment for people that will sometimes wake them up and say, wow, you know what? Maybe it's time to go into therapy. Maybe it's time to set better boundaries in my personal life. Whatever that something is, it's different for each individual, but there's always something to gain from connecting those dots, a lesson. Um, yeah.
Absolutely. And the workplace has changed, right? I
Oh,
remember,
yeah.
when we first entered the workforce when I was younger, you never talked about your personal life. It
It's true.
was, you weren't supposed to let those things affect you at work. At work, you were a worker bee and nothing else. And as you said, there are still things that happen in our lives. And so creating that separation, yeah, as happens in the psyche, it's a bad thing. It's going to create issues.
Right.
But
Right.
now our workplace and our home lives have come together so much. And I definitely personally, in my own experience, feel more comfortable, sharing and actually being understood, right? So, like the
Mm,
idea of having a work life balance is important to everyone. And
sure.
so, if I say, well, I can't have a call on Thursday because my daughter has a play and I really would like to be there, there's very few instances where my feedback is going to be like, well, no, I don't care. I need to have the call. They're going to be like, oh, yeah, okay, well, let's schedule around that.
Right. Well,
Right.
and I want to put an asterisk against what you said because I think, excuse me, it's also a very generational thing too. Depending on who you're talking to, some of the more mature generations may not still struggle to see the value because they didn't
True.
have that when they were working up the ladder. Right. So when
True.
you talk about differences in the workplace, I totally agree with you. The biggest difference is that we've got 5 generations working together side by side. We've actually never been here before because of modern medicine and technology. We have, diversity in terms of generation, but that each generation labels hard work very differently, right? And each generation kind of looks at life work balance a little differently. I mean, if you ask a boomer or someone older, they'll be like, what do you mean life work balance? Like, I didn't have that when I was younger. And why should others have that? And so there's definitely a little bit of a generational war, if you want to label it that way, and which can create conflict. But I do think one of the good things that came out of the pandemic is it did kick the door open to talking about things like mental health and
Mhm.
wellness. And it was always a stigma. That was something we just never talked about, right? You kind of kept your personal stuff at the door. But I think smart employers now recognize that when you can strike that good balance between, caring for them as an employee, but also caring about them on a human level, you start to notice more output, especially for the younger generation.
Mm.
And listen, I mean, when we age, we're supposed to learn from the prior generations. We're supposed to, right? I mean, if you look at the boomer generation and older, they were having midlife crises and they were having nervous breakdowns in the mid 50s and 60s. Well, why is that, right? Because they didn't necessarily talk about things like mental health or emotional wellness, right?
Right.
And the younger generation, I think, has really put a bigger focus on this. And when someone says I want to go home because I want to go see my kid play soccer, um, we have to pause a little bit. Our knee-jerk reaction may be, resistance, but
Mhm.
I think we have to sort of reflect a little bit and ask ourselves, or maybe ask them, tell me why this is important to you. And when you understand what drives the needs of your employee, you're able to better lead them. And when you allow them to take care of their home life, they'll be more prepared to come back to work. When you talk about creating engaging workforces, that's a great way to do it, is to
Mhm.
allow them to take care of what's at home so that they can come and be present for work. Um, and so our life has many different facets. It's not just work. But if you want
Absolutely.
hard workers, you've got to take care of them on a human level too.
Yeah, yeah. It's that bring your whole self to work and appreciate
Absolutely.
how your
Absolutely.
coworkers need to bring them their whole selves to work too. So the workplace has really changed, right? How do you think COVID and everything we had to go through has changed the workplace dynamic?
Mm,
Obviously, we've got this balance with you highlighted one issue, which was that we've become much more in tuned to mental health. We now have this introduction of remote work, which is sort of
yeah,
permeated the entire workforce. And for, like you say, younger generations, it's almost a requirement, right? If
sure.
they are in a field where they have that ability to work remotely, employees are insisting that they want to work a certain amount of time at least remotely. What do you think these are permanent
Yeah.
changes? Do you think we're going to swing back? What do you think?
Oh, I think it's going to be hard to swing back, and I'll tell you why. Because it's a hard sell to say that everybody's got to be back in the office full time when we were productive and effective working remotely. So I think it's become a more of a strategic conversation for employers to think about, what kind of balance can we strike here? Because it's like you said, the younger generation, it's almost a requirement for them to have that balance, especially if it's something that's possible in their industry. Of course, when we're talking about healthcare and other things, it may not be possible, but those companies and those organizations and those hospitals and those systems still have to think about the strategy. May not look exactly like a private employer, but but it still requires a conversation in terms of what kind of flexibility can we offer? Because I do think flexibility is an important retention strategy, or else you will find yourself with a revolving door, especially with the younger generation.
Which
I Yeah,
no, go ahead. I see that a lot. Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But I think when you ask like what are some of the biggest changes, I mean, I as much as I am a big fan of remote work, I don't think having fully remote is necessarily the answer either, because for people that are newly starting in their career, for people that love, like, enjoy mentoring, you don't get those water cooler conversations when everyone's remote. Not to say that you can't strategically cultivate online communities, but it
Hmm.
takes a pretty progressive leader to be able to create that. So I mean, and again, it's possible, but I do think a hybrid model is a great way to continue to build social connection when you're in the office, but you also have to make sure that your culture is something that people want to come in and be a part of too. If your culture is negative, if you're micromanaging, if you're breathing down people's necks, nobody's going to want to come into the office. So,
Hmm.
you want to make sure that you're creating an environment that's welcoming for people. Um, I do think, though, leading a hybrid team certainly is more challenging for leaders. So I do think it does require investing in leadership training and leadership development. Because if you were a micromanager before the pandemic, then having someone work remote is scary. And we all know micromanaging doesn't work long term. Short term it might, but it usually backfires. People want to be trusted. People want to work autonomously. But of course, there has to be rules of engagement around that too, so that the leader can allow them to work autonomously. So it does call on us as employers to make sure that we're giving the leaders the right toolbox for this modern landscape. And
Hmm.
what worked 15 years ago, what worked 8 years ago as a leader may not be working now. So it does require leaders to be agile, to be open minded to leading in ways that might be a little bit different than what they're used to. And it does force leaders to figure out how to create trusting relationships. which is something that leaders struggle with, which is why sometimes we micromanage, and so I think those are the key pieces. I also think, I mean, I'm going to be honest here. I think mental health
Mhm.
certainly has become more of a glaring issue. And I'm speaking now from the lens of an ex-psychotherapist. I'm seeing a lot more mental health playing out, no, whether it's people seem more burnt out, or they're not turning on their webcams when they're required to. I'm talking about simple, small behavioral things that might be red flags, or refusing to accept delegated work, or not showing up to team building activities that you invest in, or people staying silent and not speaking up in meetings. These could all be possible indications of mental health. Also, poor impulse control, poor
Mhm.
listening skills, especially if you saw your employee as one way before the pandemic, and now you're starting to see them display other things, right? So those also could be indications that mental health is at play. So I do think that smart employers should be investing in wellness support,
Mhm.
whether it's a wellness program, whether it's making sure they know how to contact resources that through their benefits, or even just having the conversation. Hey, how is everybody doing? And being open to hearing what their perspectives are and what their experience is. Um, so I do think that there's definitely a need to focus more on wellness. That's an important piece to this. And I don't think just because we're post pandemic that we can sort of say, oh, glad that was over. I think we're going to
Mhm.
see a ripple effect for years to come. But however, I want to, and I'm a realist, but I'm also an optimist. I think if employers leverage this in the right way, um, it can actually strengthen teams. You can create stronger cultures. You can create more loyal workforce. So through hardship can often come a lot of positive things. But if we ignore it, you might be putting yourself in a tough spot.
Right. Change is hard, but generally for the better, right?
Absolutely. Well
So we
put.
talked we talked about this concept of psychological safety. So something you said there was really stood out to me, which is, not only being mindful of mental health in the workplace, but creating an environment where leaders are listening and taking that information and doing something with it, and not
Yeah.
just lip service to a wellness program, if you will.
Right, right. Yeah, I mean that's a big buzzword, psychological safety, but I think it's a word that's going to become mainstream because
Mhm.
I mean, let's define what psychological safety is first for your audience. It's really the notion that people can speak up and without fear. They can make mistakes without fear of, punishment or repercussion. They can challenge decisions to their leaders. And this idea of psychological safety is important, especially for younger generations, because when people feel safe, they can bring their entire self to work and they can be part of the growth of the organization. Nobody wants to be part of a company where decisions are made, they're not involved, their voice is not heard. And if you want buy-in, if you want people all rowing in the same direction, creating safe spaces where people can be honest is imperative, Um, and that is a notion that I think employers should certainly think about is, are we creating psychologically safe spaces? I'll tell you one question to ask yourself. If you're the only one doing the talking in the meeting, there's a good indication this is an area of opportunity for you and your organization because it should be collaborative. And I like what you said before. If people bring ideas to the table and it turns into just lip service, over promising or saying, great idea, let's do that, and then you don't do it, that erodes trust, which is a very important need that we all have in our workplace. So, psychological safety doesn't mean you have to overpromise to every idea that comes. It just
Mhm.
means creating a space where people feel comfortable bringing those ideas to the table. And you're allowed to say no. You're allowed to
Mhm.
say, you know what? that's a really great idea. I just don't know if that's something we can honor right now, but I certainly will keep that in the back of my mind. And that when you respond in that way, it tells people that you can bring your ideas, that we're here to listen. And it also creates a workforce of strategic thinkers. You want people to bring ideas to the table. Listen, this is a perfect example. If someone of a younger generation gets hired and they have a better idea on how to do something that has been done the same way for 50 years, what better way to celebrate that than by honoring it and saying, you know what? We've been doing it this way for 50 years. It might be a little antiquated. Let's talk more about this. What ideas do you have? And maybe that's something that you and I can work on together. You want people to stay and stick around and be loyal. That's a great strategy, especially for the younger generation, because they're all about technology. They're all about
Yeah.
efficiency.
Yeah.
And we could learn something from them. If they have a better way of doing something, then my gosh, we should be celebrating that, you know?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And things have changed in the last 50 years, right? We've got technology, we've got,
Ah,
ways of thinking and approaches that we did not have
absolutely.
back then. So
Technology
clearly,
is rapidly changing, and if we can get people to bring those ideas, that's huge, right? That's
yeah,
huge.
use access to that extra brain power there.
Yeah, for sure.
So clearly, leadership styles influence workplace dynamics. How can leaders in the modern workplace adapt their approach to different teams in different situations? Now, you might have a team that is hybrid, part remote, part in the office. You might have another team that's all hybrid or that's all in the office. Um, what do leaders need to do and be aware of? How can they improve their own,
Yeah,
adaptability?
that's a great question. What I love about leadership, and I think I'm not going to take credit for this next thing I'm going to say. I believe Simon Sinek said this. He's a wonderful speaker on leadership. You should definitely check out his videos on YouTube if you haven't already done so. But he talks about how leadership doesn't mean we have to be perfect. It's what you do when you become imperfect. So recognizing that you may not know everything at every single moment of every experience, and to be open to other ways of learning and knowing. So being an agile learner, I think, is important in today's modern workplace. And with that said, you don't have to know how to do everything, but positioning yourself in a way where you allow feedback from others, right? One of the things that I notice leaders do, this is something I notice a lot with those that I work and those that I coach, is that leaders do performance reviews, right? And I'm all for performance reviews. I think it's a great way to benchmark and talk about goal setting and how they're doing and where they're headed and things that they can improve and also areas of strength. But that oftentimes ends up being a one-way conversation, right? It's the leader telling the employee how they're doing, here's your score, and here's what I'd like to see next year. But one thing that we forget to do as leaders is we forget to ask them, so what feedback do you have for me? How can I
Mhm.
improve in terms of leading you? Tell me something about yourself that maybe I don't know that might help me better lead you. And that goes back to modern leadership. 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, if you were to take a leadership course, it was basically treat everybody the same, lead everybody the same. But now it's about creating a playbook for each person. And the better you understand your employees, the better you can lead them. But see, here's the thing, going back to psychological safety, if you don't have a safe space, they're not going to give you any information. They're not going to give you any feedback. And so it's funny. I have a client that I have been coaching for many years, and I had this exact conversation with her about how to give a good performance review. How do you make it a two-way conversation? And she took my suggestion and she said to the employee, what feedback do you have for me? And when I tell you, she got silence, right? And of course, she came back to her session and she's like, I did everything you said I should do. And then I didn't get any information. And
Mhm.
I encourage her to keep asking, keep asking. And, some people do reviews once a year. I'm a big fan of doing a review, formal review once a year, but having multiple check-ins. And during those check-ins, you can ask, I asked her, during those check-ins, I want you to ask, again, I'm asking for feedback. I'm really begging for feedback. What can you share with me that's going to help me better lead you? Do you know it took her a year of asking to finally get feedback? And I don't know, I'm not going to say the word because I want to be respectful of the audience, but the feedback was, you have a resting bee face, right? And you scare me sometimes, and that causes me to not be able to ask questions. And that's why it's taken me so long to give you feedback. And when I tell you, I worked with my client for a long time to prepare her of what feedback she might receive. Because because the fact that these employees weren't giving feedback was an indication that maybe it wasn't safe, right?
Right. Something
And
going.
so she rehearsed, she practiced, and her response was, wow, thank you for that feedback. I really appreciate it. I'm going to take some time to reflect on that and get back to you. And it turns out that this person that I'm referring to has 90% hearing loss. And oftentimes she wears hearing aids, but oftentimes she's very deep in thought and she's not always paying attention to her facial expressions. So and that's also one of the reasons why sometimes people would call her name and she wouldn't respond. They thought she was turning her back to them, but in fact, she didn't hear them, and they had no idea that she had hearing loss. So it turned into a conversation about her being a little vulnerable and sharing her why behind sometimes why her face looks the way it did. And it completely shifted the dynamics of her and her team. So feedback is really important. That's how we grow as leaders. The way we view ourselves is oftentimes different than the way others view us. We have blind spots as leaders. And so I think when we can put ourselves in a position to get honest feedback, that helps our growth journey as a leader.
What a great
yeah.
story. Very interesting. So just sort of a shift in having the leader open up a little more about herself and why she is, and her why, as you said. I can imagine that once the employees understood this, and then that would increase their ability, their confidence, and approaching her more directly and creating more conversations. Very interesting.
Yeah, it eliminated the misunderstanding. And misunderstandings happen all the time. As humans, we misfire all the times. We connect the wrong dots. That's why talking about it is so important, because when you talk about it, you start to realize, you know what, I maybe didn't label this correctly. And that the light bulb moment can shift everything. I've seen people have severe conflict. They couldn't even be in the room together with each other. And by shifting perspective, I've seen people become best friends afterwards. It's amazing how just communicating and uncovering misunderstandings can really shift dynamics. Yeah.
So, what strategies do you suggest employers employ to keep their teams motivated?
So you're talking about engagement, motivation. Yeah, great question. So I have a bunch of ideas. I think the first one is transparency and communication. I think sometimes leaders make decisions, but they don't necessarily communicate those changes or decisions. And then I get the phone call of like, I can't get them to accept change. My team is not good with change. And then I come to find out, leaders made all these decisions and never really informed them or never included them, which created a lack of buy-in. So the word communication, I mean, I could talk for days on communication. It is truly an art, and it will never be perfect at it. It is always an ongoing process of figuring out how to communicate in a way that builds trust, transparency, and respect. And people oftentimes think of communication as talking, but I always say we got two ears and one mouth for a reason. A big part of communication is listening. And I can tell you that in my experience as a psychotherapist and now as a workplace behavioral specialist, we really struggle with listening. We really fall short. I mean, we do a lot of communicating. We email, we Slack, we instant message, we tweet, we text, we email, but I don't always see a lot of listening going on. So if you want people to be engaged, listen to them. Have a town hall meeting twice a year. Put focus groups together where people can get together and identify ways to improve the workplace. People have ideas. We just have to listen, right? So I think that's a big one. The next one is, did you want to respond to that? I want to pause for a moment.
No, yeah, that's very insightful. It's not just about sending the communications, it's about receiving the communications. So true.
Absolutely. And it alleviates sometimes the pressure of leadership too, right? And the owner. You don't have to know it all. You have to be open to listening because you've hired good qualified people. Let them bring their ideas to the table. Let them strategize. And then when you allow them to do that, you start to identify your future leaders too. You know, um, the next thing that I think is a really motivating thing for employees is recognition. And I can't tell you how many times I hear from an employer, we don't spend enough time on this. We give feedback where they can improve, but we don't spend the time recognizing good work. And so it requires leaders to pick their heads up more, and identify, how we can recognize good effort, hard work, or risk taking, or good decision making. But when we're inundated with business, with work, with to-do lists, it's hard to notice that stuff. But that's a great way to motivate people. But I do want to caution employers, and I learned this actually not too long ago, that not everybody likes public recognition. So when you want to recognize people, you also want to find out how they want to be recognized. Some people, believe it or not, some people don't want it. Interesting, because it embarrasses them. Or they may say a private email, or they might say, in a one-on-one, or they'll tell you what they're comfortable with. And then you might hear people say, you know what, I want balloons and a cake. I want you to like notify the entire company, and those are our extroverts, right? And so, sometimes recognizing people in a way that doesn't sit well with them can backfire. We might think it might be motivating. Again, if you're an extroverted leader, you might be thinking why wouldn't everybody appreciate,
Right.
a huge announcement, right? But not everybody does. So finding out, again, going back to tailoring your approach based on each employee, finding out what's the best way you want to be recognized. And
How do you find that out?
You ask.
Just have a conversation with the
Yeah,
employee.
you have, again, going back to the communication. Yeah, you ask them, and when you ask those questions, and this is a good tip for leaders, most of what we communicate is in the form of body language, right? In fact, studies show that 55% of our message is in nonverbal, and so we can lie out of our mouth. We can certainly we could say what we think they want to hear, but our body language never lies. Why? Because our body language is driven by our subconscious brain. So it's how we really feel about things. So when you ask a question, pay attention, put your phone down, close your laptop, make eye contact, and if you're in a virtual environment, make it a Zoom call and encourage them to turn their webcam on, because what they say may not be really what they mean. And it's okay for an employer to say, or a leader to say, I sensed you were a little uncomfortable when I asked that. Tell me more. And they may say, you know what, to be honest with you, I really don't like when you send an email to the entire company. I really would prefer if it was more like a private celebration. And here's a tip for leaders: don't take it personal. I believe we all are doing our best. We all come to work wanting to do our best. But if you get honest feedback, learn from it. And it doesn't mean you failed. It just means now you learned something new about the other person. And thank them for that honest feedback. That's how you create psychological safety, right? Yeah.
I guess that's got to be challenging for leaders too, is the
It is. It
invite
is.
invite the feedback and then accept the feedback.
But wouldn't you rather know than not?
I would,
Right?
absolutely.
I
Yeah.
mean, it's still a factor. It's still there. Why not uncover it, right? Because if you don't uncover it, that's the kind of stuff that leads to office gossip and negativity. Because if they're not telling you, they're telling someone,
That's
you know?
true. Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, it's hard to hear, but if you depersonalize it, right? And I know that's hard to do for a lot of us because we want to hear that we're doing well in everything, but we, as good leaders, know that we have blind spots. A good leader knows that we have blind spots. So if you follow along that mindset, you're going to find out it from times to time that you may have misstepped. You may have, I'll give you an example. I have an employer that decided to change their entire benefits plan, their medical benefits for their team. What was the reason that drove this decision was they wanted their employees to have better benefits. It was a better policy, and it was all around a better decision in terms of this CEO. But when they rolled it out, it caused an uproar. Why? Because people weren't told prior. They found that they had to change doctors, and some of them had been going to the same doctors for years. So here's a perfect example of how a leader can make a decision that they feel comes from the heart, but it still may not land in the way that they want. Doesn't mean they made a mistake. It just means we just need to listen better, communicate better. There's always lessons, right? And if we get defensive, we'll miss the lesson, right? And next time this employer may have a town hall meeting about it. They may get some anonymous feedback from, they may do a survey. They might, I don't know, they may create a focus group to figure out, which plan do you think is best. I don't know. But the reality is there's always something to learn. And that's why I don't like the word mistake, because mistakes have, it's got like a negative connotation. I like to use the word misstep or area of opportunity, because we only learn when things get hard. If you think about it, if you look at our personal lives, we don't learn when things are easy. We don't learn when things are status quo. We do learn when things get a little messy. And so a progressive, modern, open-minded leader will take a misstep and say, what can we learn from this? How can we do this different next time? And that's how you grow, you know?
Very interesting. Yes, and that makes perfect sense. Perfect sense. So what predictions do you have for the future of the workplace, say in the next 5 years or so?
I think we're going to have to focus even more on wellness. This younger generation, this up and coming generation, I guess, Gen Zers, I'm reading about this generation, and um, majority of them have some kind of mental health challenge, whether it's ADHD, ADD, anxiety, depression. And so I think it's going to call on employers to focus even more on cultivating psychologically safe environments where people can bring their whole self to work, but figuring out a toolbox to properly find that balance. And I don't want employers to think, well, God, sounds like Taryn's saying that every workplace should turn into a therapy session. I'm not saying that at all, but there is a balance there. And I think, it's about giving leaders the toolbox to be able to find that balance, from listening and empathizing and maybe offering an occasional accommodation, but also empowering them to get back to work. And that's going to require a new toolbox. I think that's what we're going to start seeing in the years to come. Yeah, I think that's the biggest focus I think leaders are going to have to hone in on.
that kind of leads me back into something you mentioned earlier about 55% of our communications being nonverbal and through body language. And then we talk about the new generations, and we've been having conversations. I've been having conversations with a lot of people, and how the younger generations are the ones that are coming into the workforce now and are the first generation that don't know a world without technology.
Yeah.
And right. So for them, having a video call is normal and having a telephone call is abnormal.
Right.
Whereas our generation, we had the phone call, and then, having that extra of the video was always, I always view it as a bonus. And I get the nonverbal communication now, and I think it's terrific.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I never looked at it from the perspective of the younger generations, where for them, they're losing a component of what they believe is a normal communication, a video call. And so they're struggling with having phone calls.
Yeah.
I just had this conversation in a recent group meeting that I had, where apparently colleges and universities are beginning to offer classes in how to have phone calls for college students, because they don't do it. They don't know how to do it. In the workplace, they would need to do it.
Mm. Interesting. I mean, I do see value in that, I do. But I think for leaders, I think we have to be open-minded, we have to be agile, we have to listen, we have to recognize that what worked 10 years ago may not work now. And that, again, requires, I think, employers to invest in leadership development. And I think it's a smart investment because the playbook has changed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. More so than I think people can even realize.
Absolutely.
You started
Yeah.
you started off by saying the biggest challenge is the multi-generational workforce, right? And I think that is so true, in terms of leading and looking at who you are leading. Things are changing so much, so quickly, that you've got to be adaptive. You've got to you have to think about things you never thought of before, right? I mean, it never occurred to me that I could have somebody working for me who doesn't feel comfortable or know how to make a phone call.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think if the workforce is changing, leaders have to change,
Absolutely.
and that's a tough one because the older we get, the more set in our ways we get,
Exactly.
And so there's that challenge too. But I think, kind of going back to my comment before about the younger generation and the need, the fact that mental health is even more at play. What I'm about to say may be a little controversial, but it's something for leaders to think about and for employers to think about. That I think leaders in this modern day not only are going to be leaders, but they might have to be a mentor. They might have to be a coach. They at times might have to be, I don't want to use the word therapist, but finding, tapping into the power of empathy to move people forward. When I go back to my therapy days, excuse me, I used to have people come to my office and say, and this happened a lot. I don't feel heard at home. I don't feel heard at work. I just want to be able to come to you every week, and I just want to vent, cry, and dump. And I don't even need advice. I just want to be heard. And I can I tell you how many times these people will come to my office individually and they would vent, cry, dump, whatever was on their mind. And my response was empathy. I'm so sorry you're going through this. This must be really challenging for you, right? And I'm telling you the power of empathy, and this goes back to emotional intelligence. One of the pillars of emotional intelligence is being able to tap into empathy because it's powerful. When you can convince someone that you hear them and you understand them, what happens is whatever is ailing them starts to dissipate. And at the end of these sessions, they would look at me, and I gave no advice. I maybe asked a couple of questions for clarity, but I was mostly responding with empathy and active listening, right? Which is being completely focused, not just on what's being said, but the emotion behind it, the meaning behind the words. And every single time at the end of those sessions, they would look at me and say, I feel so much better. Their problem didn't go away. I didn't wave a magic wand and eliminate whatever was stressing them. But what I did do is provide a psychologically safe space for them to be heard and empathize. And at the end of that conversation, oftentimes they would look at me and say, you know what? I think I have an idea on how I might fix this. Or I think I've identified a new boundary that I can set or a solution to this problem. And many times people think you have to come up with the solution. Most of the time, people don't need you to tell them what to do. Sometimes they're looking for advice, but most times they want to be heard, because when people are heard, they calm down. And then they can start thinking strategically about whatever's in front of them. Because when I say emotions are high, our intelligence goes down. So if you can allow people a safe space to process that, their intelligence comes back and they're able to think and strategize and problem solve. And it's so much better when you can get someone to a place where they can come up with a solution rather than telling someone something's what they should do.
Sure, of course.
That's how you empower people. That's how people grow. So yeah. I know that was a long-winded response, but yeah.
Yeah, very insightful. I love that. It's so true. You really hit the nail on the head there.
Thank you.
So before I let you go, I have one last question for you, which I did not prepare you for. And we always wrap up our podcast with. And that question is, what keeps you up at night?
Ooh, that's a good one. You know what keeps me up at night? No, you know what the first word that came to mind is I want people to have peace. And peace comes from internal. Peace does not come from external. It comes from learning to be aware of the conversations in your mind, being self-aware of when to disconnect from your work, managing the tendency to overwork. You know, we want to go on vacations because we think that's what's going to fix our burnout or our stress. But it's really about mastering what goes on in our minds. So that's the stuff that keeps me up at night, is just, I want peace for people. And as corny as that might sound, I want world peace, but I want individual peace. I think if we each can work on our individual self, we will bring more peace to the world.
Taryn, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. If people want to reach out to you, where can they find you?
Great question. Thank you for that. My company is Empower Behavioral Services, and you can email me at info@empower, EMPOWER, behavioral services with an S at the end, .com. You can also call me directly at 973-803-8276. You can also find me on LinkedIn as well.
Terrific. Feel free to reach out to Taryn with any questions. She will empower your employer, your workplace.
Yes.
Thank you for listening. This has been the Think Factory's Workplace Podcast. I'm Alka Bahal, signing off until next time.